Thank you very much. And again, my apologies for the disruption on the time. I'm very happy to be with you all today. I'm only sorry that we can't be gathered together in person. So hopefully at some future date, we'll get that opportunity. So the situation here in the United States obviously is in full crisis mode, with killing on top of trial. And yet we continue to hear this discourse from many circles about the need to reform the police. Well, in the wake of the killings of Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and so many others by police in the period about 6 years ago, we were told then, don't worry, we're going to fix the police. We're going to reform them. President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing that issued a huge collection of reforms to be enacted in order to fix policing. And cities and other jurisdictions across the United States have adopted many of these reforms. In New York City, we got body cameras, implicit bias training, de-escalation training, improvements in our civilian oversight system. In Minneapolis, the officers who were involved in the killing of George Floyd had implicit bias training, mindfulness training, de-escalation training. We're wearing body cameras. We're operating under a new use of force policy based on the President Obama's task force's guidelines. We're operating under a new policy that required that officers intervene if they see misconduct by a fellow officer. They were operating under a new early warning system designed to identify problem officers. And none of it made any difference. George Floyd's life did not matter to them, and no amount of training or oversight or, frankly, prosecutions, I think, is going to make any difference. So let me talk a little bit about some of these reforms. I'll talk a little bit about how we got into this mess, in my view. And then if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about what I mean about this concept of abolition. So one of the reforms that was central to the reform movement is in the Obama task force report, is in the recent bill passed by the US House of Representatives, is implicit bias training. It's so popular, it's made its way to Europe. It's very common now in the UK and is being implemented in some other jurisdictions within the European Union. Implicit bias training imagines that the problems of the racially disparate outcomes of policing are the result of unconscious, unintentional bias that can be fixed with a few hours of sensitivity training. This is laughable. First of all, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look at the Facebook pages and the chat boards and even the official statements of some police union leaders, these statements are explicitly racist. We recently discovered that a high-ranking NYPD official had been using a fake name for years on chat boards to post intensely racist viewpoints. And guess what his job was in the NYPD? He was in charge of the Equal Opportunity Employment Office. He was the person that you went to complain about racist and sexist behavior within the NYPD. And he himself was explicitly racist. But there's a bigger problem here, because it's certainly not the case that every police officer in the United States is a racist. Policing has become much more diverse. In big cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Detroit, a majority of police officers are non-white. And many police chiefs in cities like Miami and Philadelphia and Detroit and Chicago are also non-white. There's a problem of structural racism here, both at the level of the institution, but also at a broader political level. The institution of policing has always been a tool for producing and maintaining systems of racial exploitation and domination, whether it's slavery, colonialism, the management of immigrant populations, the production of Jim Crow, convict leasing, the ghettoization of northern cities have all been at the center of the American policing project. And to then be surprised when that institution produces racially disparate outcomes is to ignore 200 years of very clear history about the nature of this institution, which I'll talk a little bit more about that history in a minute. But there's an even bigger problem, which is beyond policing. It's the decision by elected officials to turn the problems of poor, mostly non-white communities over to policing to solve. We've framed problems of poverty, vulnerability, and social marginalization into problems of crime to be solved by violence workers. Because that's what police are. That's what distinguishes police from other government workers, is the capacity and authorization to use violence. That's the basis of police authority. And even when that police authority is enacted according to rules and procedures, it has a negative impact on those who experience it, directly and indirectly. And it is a decision to not implement other kinds of strategies to deal with these problems. Strategies rooted in care, compassion, restoration, building people and communities up instead of subjecting them to criminalization. This is a problem I have with community policing. Community policing is always reinvented every time there's a crisis in the legitimacy of policing, whether it's after the Rodney King riots, after the killing of Amadou Diallo by the NYPD, and in this current moment, all police officials and politicians want to talk about community policing as if this is somehow going to magically transform the nature of policing. First of all, the community of community policing is never particularly representative of the actual communities that are heavily policed in the United States. The people in the community that the police are in dialogue with tend to be landlords, business owners, religious leaders. There are no young people in these meetings, no recent immigrants, no folks who are homeless or who have drug involvement or who've been in the criminal justice system. Their views are not considered legitimate in these settings, and they are actively excluded. But again, there is a bigger problem, and that is the fundamental premise of community policing is that the community should bring all of its problems to the police, no matter how small or unconnected to the actual law, for the police to solve. But what tools do police have to solve community problems? They are violence workers. The tools they have are guns and handcuffs and ticket books and pepper spray and water cannons and tear gas, right? Do they have access to stable housing, high quality medicalized drug treatment, community-based mental health services, supports for families in crisis? No, they don't have access to any of the tools that could actually produce healthy, safe communities in a more sustainable way that doesn't rely on violence, coercion, and punishment. Body cameras, we were told, well, you have to give up some privacy to get police accountability. But what the research is showing us is that we're getting neither. What we're getting is enhanced police powers. A recent high quality peer-reviewed study in Washington, D.C. found that body cameras had absolutely no measurable effect on officer behavior. They did an experimental study where some got the cameras and some didn't over an extended period of time. And the city of Washington, D.C. said, well, we don't really care that there's been no change to officer behavior. We're going to give the body cameras to all police. Why? Because we're using them for evidence collection. So we're getting more surveillance, but no police accountability. Even things like tasers that were implicated in the recent death in Minnesota, we were told, again, after police kill someone and there's a crisis of legitimacy, police and the manufacturers of these devices say, we have a solution to all this killing. Give us millions of dollars to buy tasers, and this will save lives. This will be police reform. But the research shows that this is not the case. No shootings have been prevented. Instead, a whole new type of police violence has been enacted, which is the tasering of people for disrespect of a police officer, or because it's easier for the police officer to do that than to put their hands on someone or try to resolve the situation more calmly, verbally, through de-escalation. So the police reform of tasers has merely expanded the amount of police violence. So how do we get into this mess of thinking that these superficial reforms will work? Well, these reforms are generally rooted in a discourse of procedural justice. Procedural justice is the idea that when we take the time to explain to people why we're arresting them or giving them a ticket, give them a chance to tell their side of the story, and follow proper procedure in an unbiased fashion, people feel better about the outcome, even if they end up getting that ticket or getting arrested. And the research is pretty clear. People do feel better when proper procedures are enacted. But this completely ignores questions of substantive justice. A perfectly lawful, procedurally proper, unbiased, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no good reason. No lives will be saved. No one will be prevented from getting drugs. No one's life will be transformed by that process. There's absolutely no justice in it. And the idea that we're going to fix the racially disparate outcomes in the war on drugs by giving narcotics units anti-bias training is ridiculous. We need to end the war on drugs. That legal framework is fundamentally unjust, and in fact was explicitly created for unjust purposes. We know that the Nixon administration embarks on the modern war on drugs as part of a rancid, racist politics, an attempt to appeal to white Southern voters in the wake of the victories of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Those white voters had historically been Democrats, and when Democrats signed civil rights legislation in the 1960s, Republicans said, come to us. We will be the new home of racism, and we will do this by creating the war on crime and the war on drugs. And these will be the tools that we will use to recreate systems of apartheid in the United States. This cannot be reformed. This must be abolished. Similarly, We've gotten into this mess because of the capitulation of both political parties in the United States to a politics of neoliberal austerity. The belief that in the face of global competition, which they themselves created, completely unregulated, predatory capitalism, they've said in the face of that, all government can do is to subsidize the already most successful economic actors in hopes that they will become so wealthy that some of their wealth will trickle down to the rest of us, right? Trickle down economics. And that this is supposed to produce prosperity. But it hasn't. What it has produced is widening gaps of inequality. It has produced mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed institutions like schools and community centers, mass participation in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods. And then these social problems that they themselves have helped create have been turned over to the police to manage. Never to solve, just to manage, to put a lid on them, to create a manageable situation so that these elected officials can continue to make their downtown real estate deals, create a tourism-centered economy, create subsidies for some corporate headquarters to relocate in their municipality. And in this way, they have systematically turned the problems of poverty and social and economic dislocation into problems of crime to be solved by policing. And a lot of this is rooted in, as well for these politicians, a kind of simplistic liberal adherence to this superficial idea of what the police do and the legal systems that they claim police are enforcing. They imagine that police are just these neutral enforcers of a legal order that benefits everyone equally. But this is not the case. First of all, police aren't really involved in enforcing the law as much as they are in producing a certain notion of social order. Much of what police do falls outside of the specifics of the legal statutes. They're managing problems of social disorder, homeless encampments, noise complaints, loose dogs, trash problems, verbal disputes between neighbors, things that aren't against the law, or things that have been turned into crimes as part of a project of empowering the policing of these populations. And the legal systems that they do enforce do not necessarily benefit everyone equally. I described this problem with the war on drugs, but even legal systems more broadly. There's a famous 19th century saying from Anatole France that says, "The law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets." But of course, the rich don't need to do these things, only the poor do. And the neutral professional implementation of laws against public camping, going to the bathroom in public, going through dumpsters for food, these legal systems only produce a burden for the already most vulnerable people in our societies. So the solution to this is not to imagine that we can just make police more professional in the pursuit of an unjust project. We need an analysis of substantive justice that demands that the state take steps to solve social problems in ways that build people and communities up instead of tearing them down through mass criminalization. This means that we've got to get police out of our schools and bring back counselors and support staff and teachers' aides, and put in place restorative justice programs and provide services to young people and families in crisis. We need to get police out of the mental health business. In the United States, between 1.25% of all people killed by police are having a mental health crisis. We've systematically defunded mental health services and turned the problem of managing the consequences of that over to police. And then when they kill people, we're told, don't worry, we'll just give them more training and this will fix the problem. Well, it hasn't. So let me just talk for a minute about what I mean by abolition. And I think of it in 3 ways. First, it's an analysis. It's an analysis that understands that policing has always been a tool for facilitating regimes of exploitation. In the 19th century, when most policing is created, this revolves around the 3 primary mechanisms of economic exploitation, which were at that time colonialism, slavery, and the formation of a stable industrial working class. And we see this in the creation of the London Metropolitan Police, which was based on the English occupation of Ireland. Sir Robert Peel, before creating the Bobbies, is in charge of that occupation, develops the Irish Peace Preservation Force to put down agricultural uprisings in the Irish countryside. And he then takes that model to London to apply it to this massive influx of rural workers who've been displaced by the enclosures movement. We see this in the rise of police forces in the American South, directly tied to the management of mobile slave populations. And we see it in the constant back and forth between the policing of colonial spaces and the policing of metropole spaces. This analysis helps us to avoid the mistakes of thinking we can fix policing with implicit bias training or body cameras. Second, abolition is a process. It's not some preordained utopia that we then just try to reverse engineer. Yes, there are principles that guide us in this, that speak to a future that we would like to try to get towards, but really, it's about looking at the massive infrastructures of policing and incarceration that we've come to rely on and articulating specific concrete ways that we can address social problems without those systems. It's a process of chipping away at that infrastructure. There's no way to just disappear all police tomorrow. No such political process exists to do that. Instead, we have to demand that we get police out of schools, out of the mental health business, out of the drug business, out of the sex work business, assess what's left, chip away at that, develop more alternatives, and at the same time work on larger structural transformations that will reduce the kinds of inequalities that produce so much of the harmful behavior that policing was created to solve. And finally, abolition is about a kind of vision, about a desire to live in a world that doesn't treat people like animals, that doesn't put human beings into cages, that doesn't rely on violence workers to solve our problems. And through this process, we can build a politics that's rooted in a more expansive notion of justice, that isn't limited to thinking of justice in terms of revenge, measuring accountability in years of incarceration, that's rooted instead in a politics of care, compassion, and solidarity. This is the solution that we need to our problems. And the current movements in the US have a lot of clarity about this and are making tremendous progress. So I'll stop there and look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you.